Certainly. Here's Section I of Humanity's Last Argument, written with a minimum of 700 words. Hashtag Section I, the nature of human conflict, seeds of the last argument. From the dawn of civilization, human beings have been creatures of contradiction, capable of love and empathy, yet also destruction and cruelty. Among the many behaviors that have shaped our history, conflict stands out as both a catalyst and a curse. Whether through violent clashes, ideological feuds, or silent struggles within the self, conflict seems embedded in the DNA of our species. The idea of a last argument, a final, catastrophic action taken when all dialogue has failed, demands we first explore the origins of our tendency toward confrontation. To understand humanity's last argument, we must understand our first ones. Conflict, in its broadest sense, is not inherently evil. It arises from difference in opinion, desire, need, or belief. In early societies, conflict was often a response to survival challenges, competing for food, land, or security. As tribes evolved into nations and nations into empires, these basic needs were increasingly entangled with identity, ideology, and power. War became a tool not just for survival, but for dominance. Yet parallel to the evolution of warfare was the emergence of diplomacy, humanity's attempt to use words instead of weapons. Language itself is a revolutionary tool for resolving conflict. It allows us to express grievance, seek compromise, and construct shared meaning. The first arguments between human beings, perhaps over fire, food, or territory, were likely chaotic and emotional. Over time, language matured, and with it came more sophisticated forms of conflict resolution. Ancient cultures developed codes and laws, like the Code of Hammurabi, and institutions such as tribal councils or religious courts arose to settle disputes. The invention of writing allowed agreements, treaties, and historical grievances to be recorded and revisited, an essential step in the evolution of organized diplomacy. In this context, diplomacy can be seen as humanity's first argument, the effort to solve problems through structured dialogue rather than force. Consider the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which sought to restore order after the Napoleonic Wars, or the more modern creation of the United Nations after World War II. These are testaments to our belief that conflict can be mitigated through reason, negotiation, and compromise. While imperfect, these systems reflect humanity's recognition that enduring peace cannot be built through domination alone. But what happens when dialogue breaks down? What occurs when communication becomes impossible or meaningless? History shows us that even the most well-intentioned diplomatic efforts can unravel under pressure. This collapse often follows predictable patterns: increasing polarization, distrust, unequal power dynamics, and the rise of zero-sum thinking. When individuals or nations no longer see the other side as human or worthy of dialogue, the door to the last argument creaks open. The First World War, for instance, erupted after a complex web of alliances, miscommunications, and nationalistic fervor overpowered rational diplomacy. In the decades prior, Europe was brimming with intellectual exchange, diplomacy, and relative peace. Yet in 1914, a single assassination in Sarajevo triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. The failure wasn't in the absence of diplomacy, but in the erosion of trust and the prioritization of pride and militarism over negotiation. This pattern has repeated itself throughout history. When reason is seen as weakness and dialogue as delay, violence becomes a seductive alternative. At the heart of the phrase, humanity's last argument, lies a haunting metaphor. The expression is believed to derive from the Latin phrase ultima ratio regum, the last argument of kings. This was famously inscribed on the cannons of Louis XIV of France, symbolizing that when all negotiations failed, the monarch would speak with fire and iron. It is both a declaration of sovereignty and a confession of despair. Reason has failed. Now only force can speak. This notion of a last argument implies not just the abandonment of dialogue, but the belief that there is no alternative. It is an ultimatum, a closing of the moral and intellectual space in which disagreement can be tolerated. When a society or a leader turns to violence as the final form of persuasion, It acknowledges that empathy, understanding, and shared humanity have been discarded. The last argument, then, is not merely about bombs or bullets, it is the collapse of the human capacity to coexist with difference. What's chilling is how easily societies can slide into this mindset. Propaganda, fear, and ideology can dehumanize opponents to the point that violence seems not only necessary but righteous. In such moments, war is no longer seen as a failure of diplomacy, but as a cleansing force. This is where the last argument finds its most dangerous voice, not as a reluctant final step, but as a celebrated act of finality. Ultimately, the seeds of the last argument are planted early, often in our everyday refusal to listen, to empathize, or to compromise. They grow in the soil of ego, fear, and ignorance. And while massive wars and violent revolutions dominate our historical narratives, the beginning of each can be traced back to a moment when words lost their power and we chose silence or steel instead. As we move forward in this exploration, we must keep asking, how many last arguments has humanity already made? And more urgently, will there be one final argument from which we cannot recover? Let me know when you're ready for Section 2, or if you'd like adjustments to the tone, depth, or examples in Section 1. Certainly. Here's Section 2 of Humanity's Last Argument, with a minimum of 700 words. Hashtag Section 2, War as the Final Language, Humanity's History of Violence. Throughout history, war has functioned as humanity's most tragic and definitive form of communication, a brutal last argument, declared when all others fail or are abandoned. Despite countless efforts to avoid it, war persists as a recurring climax in the human story. While often justified as necessary, war has frequently served as a failure of imagination, empathy, and diplomacy. To understand the full weight of humanity's last argument, we must examine war as both a tool and a statement, the moment when talk ends and destruction begins. Hashtag a war through the ages. The story of organized violence is as old as civilization itself. In early societies, warfare was largely tribal and rudimentary, often centered around immediate survival, resources, territory, and defense. These battles, while violent, were typically small in scale. But as human societies evolved and centralized power through kingdoms and empires, war began to shift from necessity to strategy. Mesopotamian city-states, the Egyptian dynasties, and later the empires of Greece and Rome turned warfare into an instrument of expansion and ideology. These ancient civilizations codified war into their social orders. It became not just a response to conflict, but an ongoing tool for ambition. Leaders like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar didn't just wage war, they built their legacies on it. Victory brought wealth, status, and divine favor, while defeat often meant obliteration. In many cases, warriors were celebrated as the highest embodiment of civic virtue, while peace was sometimes regarded as stagnation or weakness. Religions soon joined the fray, transforming wars from contests over land and power into spiritual mandates. The Crusades, for instance, exemplify how war could be framed as divine duty. These conflicts, often carried out in the name of God, did not just pit armies against each other. They pitted worldviews, identities, and moral absolutes. Violence was sanctified, and compromise was seen as betrayal. Hashtag B. The rise of total war ***. The arrival of industrialization marked a terrifying transformation in warfare, the shift from limited, regional battles to total war, where entire populations and economies became part of the war machine. Now, the last argument had the capacity to be uttered not in isolated events, but across continents. The First World War shattered any romantic notion of honorable battle. Trench warfare, chemical weapons, and mass conscription turned young men into cannon fodder. It wasn't just soldiers who died, it was a generation. The Second World War escalated this further. Civilians became intentional targets through strategic bombings and genocidal campaigns. The Holocaust remains one of the darkest examples of industrialized atrocity, a systematic, bureaucratic extermination of millions. For the first time, humans saw what it meant to wage war with machines, not just weapons. The line between soldier and civilian disappeared. War had become omnivorous. And then came the bomb, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With the detonation of 2 nuclear weapons, war crossed a line from catastrophic to potentially apocalyptic. The last argument had reached a new definition, not just the end of diplomacy, but possibly the end of the world. The Cold War that followed was a prolonged standoff in which words were continually sharpened, but never allowed to escalate into actions, for fear that the final argument would be made, and that nothing would remain afterward. ####C. The moral weight of war ****. With each advancement in weaponry, the question has grown louder. Can war ever be justified? Theories of just war, rooted in thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas, propose strict conditions under which war might be morally defensible if it's waged in self-defense, if it's proportional, if civilians are protected. Yet history is littered with wars that violated these principles, often under the pretext of justice or necessity. Modern international law has tried to codify rules of war, from the Geneva Conventions to the Hague Regulations. But enforcement remains difficult, especially when powerful nations are involved. War crimes, mass displacement, and indiscriminate bombings still occur. Civilians remain the most affected, children growing up amid rubble, entire cultures erased in days. Even when war is framed as moral, it leaves behind questions. What is one, really, when a nation is reduced to ash? Can peace imposed through violence ever last? These questions are not only theoretical, they haunt veterans, survivors, and historians alike. ###D. War and identity. War doesn't only change the physical world, it transforms the people within it. For soldiers, war often creates a dual identity, before and after. Veterans return home to find themselves unable to reintegrate, carrying trauma invisible to the eye, but heavy on the soul. For civilians, war shapes collective memory. A destroyed city becomes a symbol, a lost family a story retold across generations. These personal and national memories become part of identity. Nations, too, use war to define themselves. Victory in war is woven into patriotism. National holidays, statues, and history books often celebrate battlefields as sacred ground. Yet this glorification risks normalizing war as a necessary part of life, rather than a failure to resolve conflict without bloodshed. Propaganda plays a key role in shaping how war is remembered and justified. From Nazi Germany's mythologizing of racial destiny to Cold War-era American rhetoric about freedom versus communism, governments have long weaponized narrative to prepare their populations for war and to explain its costs afterward. In doing so, they transform the final argument into a patriotic ritual, one that blurs the horror with the heroic. Conclusion to Section 2 ***. Across millennia, humanity has turned to war not just as a last resort, but as a familiar refrain, a language it returns to when words falter or pride prevails. Whether tribal or global, religious or political, defensive or aggressive, war has remained a persistent human strategy, even as its consequences have grown more catastrophic. It is the loudest argument, the most visible, and perhaps the most costly in every sense. The tragedy is not merely in the loss of life, but in the normalization of violence as a form of persuasion. The more we speak through war, the more difficult it becomes to hear any other voice. As we advance into an era of unprecedented technological power, the stakes of invoking the final argument grow exponentially. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether war is inevitable, but whether we are willing to imagine something beyond it. Let me know when you'd like to continue with Section 3, or if you want edits or a different emphasis in this section.
Certainly.
Here's Section 3 of Humanity's Last Argument, with a minimum of 700 words. #Section 3, The Age of Existential Risk, Technology, and the Final Argument. As the 20th century drew to a close, the world stood on the edge of an unsettling realization. Humanity's tools had outgrown its wisdom. With each technological leap, nuclear power, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, the potential for catastrophic misuse grew. Unlike the spears and swords of earlier eras, today's innovations have the power not only to settle disputes, but to end civilization altogether. We are no longer in an age of conventional warfare, but in the era of existential risk, where the last argument could be irreversible. In this section, we confront how modern technology has transformed conflict and how humanity now faces the terrifying possibility of making its final statement, intentionally or not. ####A. The rise of doomsday tools, ****. The invention of nuclear weapons in the 1940s marked a turning point in human history. With the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, war ceased to be merely destructive. It became annihilating. The Cold War that followed was a grim balancing act based on mutually assured destruction, MAD. The idea that if either side launched a nuclear attack, both would be obliterated. This was not peace born from understanding or empathy. It was peace enforced by the knowledge that war had become too dangerous to wage. Today, the threat of nuclear conflict has not disappeared. In fact, proliferation has made it more volatile. North Korea's nuclear tests, tensions between India and Pakistan, and the erosion of nuclear treaties between superpowers all contribute to a fragile global equilibrium. The logic of MAD still holds, but only just one miscommunication, one malfunction, or one rogue leader could ignite humanity's last argument in a matter of minutes. Beyond nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, AI, presents a newer and more abstract threat. AI is not inherently violent, but in the wrong hands or poorly regulated systems, it can act as an autonomous agent of destruction. Nations are already experimenting with autonomous drones, capable of identifying and killing targets without human intervention. Critics warn of a future where wars are fought by machines, unfeeling, fast, and imprecise in moral judgment. In a worst-case scenario, a superintelligent AI could act against human interests entirely, especially if programmed with poorly defined goals. Thinkers like Nick Bostrom have explored the possibility of an AI optimizing for a goal in a way that disregards human life, a theoretical, yet chilling, version of the last argument, a machine carrying out a command we can no longer control. ###B. The ethics of creation ****. Technological power is not inherently evil. It reflects human intention. But this raises a profound ethical question. Just because we can create something, should we? The scientists of the Manhattan Project, who built the atomic bomb, later expressed regret over what they had unleashed. Robert Oppenheimer famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita. ***, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. ***. Modern parallels exist in the tech sector today. AI developers, genetic engineers, and data scientists often work in gray ethical areas, pushing boundaries faster than regulation can keep up. The profit-driven nature of much modern research adds another layer of risk. Corporations may prioritize innovation and market dominance over long-term safety and social responsibility. There is also the issue of dual-use technologies, tools that can be used for good or harm depending on the intent. CRISPR gene editing, for example, can cure diseases, but it can also be used to create biological weapons or ethically dubious forms of genetic enhancement. In such an environment, the final argument may not come from military strategy, but from an accident, oversight, or malicious misuse of emerging science. ###C. Environmental collapse as a non-human last argument. Sometimes, the most devastating argument might not come from humans at all, but from nature, responding to human negligence. Climate change represents a slow-moving yet potentially terminal threat to civilization. Rising temperatures, extreme weather, and resource scarcity have already begun to displace populations and trigger conflicts. Scholars have identified climate as a threat multiplier, exacerbating existing tensions and making cooperation more difficult. Consider the 2011 Syrian civil war, which some researchers link to prolonged droughts that devastated agriculture and forced mass urban migration. or the rising tensions between nations sharing rivers, such as Egypt and Ethiopia over the Nile. As fresh water and arable land become scarcer, the stage is set for new forms of conflict, not over ideology or religion, but over basic survival. Nature's last argument could come in the form of rising seas swallowing cities, mass extinction collapsing ecosystems, or pandemics arising from environmental disruption. In these scenarios, humanity isn't waging war, it's being challenged to respond to the consequences of its own excess. #D. Dystopias and cultural reflections. Our collective anxieties around these technological and ecological risks are vividly reflected in literature, cinema, and art. Dystopian works like George Orwell's 1984, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and more recently, films like Children of Men or Black Mirror depict futures shaped by surveillance, authoritarianism, dehumanization, and environmental collapse. These stories do more than entertain. They serve as cultural warning signs. They ask us to imagine the endpoint of our current trajectories. What happens when we trade freedom for security? When we prioritize efficiency over empathy? When machines learn to think, but we forget how to feel? Perhaps these cultural reflections are attempts to process, or even prevent, the final argument. They remind us that technology is a mirror, and what we build often reflects who we are. If our tools become destructive, it's because we program them that way. If our future becomes dystopian, it's because we chose not to act while we still had the chance. Conclusion to Section 3**. In the 21st century, the final argument may not come from a battlefield in the traditional sense. It may arrive in code, in data, in rising temperatures, or in an engineered virus. The danger now is not just in conflict, but in complexity. We are creating systems we barely understand, with consequences we cannot always predict. But there is still time to change course. The same technologies that threaten us also hold the key to unprecedented cooperation, sustainability, and understanding. The challenge is to ensure that the tools we wield serve peace rather than destruction, wisdom rather than ambition. The future will be shaped not just by what we invent, but by how we govern, regulate, and, most importantly, imagine our responsibilities. If we are to avoid humanity's final argument, we must become fluent not in war, but in foresight and in restraint. Let me know when you're ready for Section 4, or if you'd like edits or additions to this section. Here is Section 4 of Humanity's Last Argument, written with a minimum of 700 words. Section 4, The Power of Prevention, Reimagining Humanity's Future, without the last argument. The prospect of a final argument, a terminal act of violence, war, or technological catastrophe, looms over modern civilization like a shadow. And yet, despite the dangers, humanity still possesses the power of choice. We are not passengers in a doomed vehicle, but navigators of our collective destiny. Avoiding our last argument is not merely a matter of hope. It is a matter of action, foresight, and imagination. This final section explores the pathways toward prevention through diplomacy, ethical governance, education, and a radical rethinking of what it means to be human in a shared world. #A. Reclaiming the power of dialogue. The first and perhaps most powerful tool for avoiding catastrophe is the one we have always had, dialogue. At its core, the final argument happens when conversation breaks down, when parties stop listening, when grievances become insurmountable, and when compromise is seen as weakness. Reclaiming dialogue means committing to empathetic listening, open communication, and transparency, especially among global leaders, institutions, and communities. In our polarized era, even within democracies, communication is often reduced to shouting matches and tribal narratives. Social media algorithms reinforce bias rather than bridge differences. Politicians weaponize rhetoric to gain power rather than to build consensus. Preventing the last argument demands a cultural shift, one that values nuance over outrage, long-term solutions over short-term popularity. This cultural shift must be reflected in global diplomacy. Rather than preparing for war, nations must invest more deeply in conflict prevention and peace-building infrastructure, including mediation training, cross-cultural exchange, and early warning systems for violence. International bodies like the United Nations, while flawed, still represent humanity's best institutional hope for resolving disputes without resorting to destruction. Reforming and strengthening these organizations could make the difference between peaceful negotiation and irreversible disaster. #B. Ethics and global responsibility in science. The technologies that could destroy us can also save us, if guided by ethics and wisdom. Scientists, engineers, and technologists must view their work not just as innovation, but as moral responsibility. From AI development to genetic research to military technology, there must be shared global standards, what some ethicists call a universal precautionary principle, to ensure safety, transparency, and human rights are always considered. This responsibility doesn't lie only with individuals. Governments must implement robust regulatory frameworks that keep pace with innovation. International coalitions, like those proposed for regulating AI and nuclear materials, must become more than symbolic. The idea that ethics is an obstacle to progress must be replaced with the understanding that ethics is progress. After all, what good is technological power if it leads to a world we cannot inhabit? Private corporations also play a crucial role. Tech companies wield enormous influence over public opinion, military systems, and surveillance capabilities. With this power must come accountability, not only to shareholders, but to the societies they affect. Policies like Tech for Good or ethical innovation must evolve from public relations slogans into enforceable global commitments. #C. Education as a foundation for peace. To truly avoid the last argument, we must start earlier. *** in classrooms, not war rooms. ***. Education is perhaps the most undervalued weapon against existential risk. A globally conscious, critically thinking, and emotionally intelligent population is far less likely to be swayed by propaganda, fear, or authoritarianism. Peace education is not about indoctrinating people with pacifism. It's about equipping them to understand conflict, see from others' perspectives, and reject violence as the first solution. Curricula around the world should include critical media literacy, ethics of technology, global citizenship, and environmental stewardship. Teaching history not as a series of wars, but as a complex story of human cooperation and failure can help young generations avoid repeating old mistakes. In a world where information spreads rapidly, misinformation spreads faster. Teaching discernment, the ability to question, to verify, to think independently, is key. Future citizens will have to navigate AI-generated content, deepfakes, and biased narratives. Education must evolve to meet that challenge, not lag behind it. #D. A new narrative for humanity ***. Perhaps the most powerful step toward avoiding the last argument is the simplest to articulate and the hardest to enact. We must reimagine ourselves. As long as we see one another as enemies, as others, as obstacles to national or personal success, the logic of conflict will persist. We must craft a new narrative, one that emphasizes shared humanity over tribal identity, cooperation over conquest, survival over supremacy. This new narrative must be supported by global institutions, media, literature, and cultural production. Art, music, storytelling, these are tools that shape collective consciousness. A generation raised on war games, nationalist myths, and dystopian films may come to see collapse as inevitable. But a generation raised on stories of collaboration, resilience, and justice may see a different future, one worth building. Religions, philosophies, and spiritual movements have long emphasized interconnectedness. From the Buddhist idea of interdependence to the Christian notion of loving one's neighbor to the Ubuntu concept of I am because we are, the world's wisdom traditions provide ample inspiration for a collective identity. The challenge now is to translate these principles into global practice. #E. What comes after avoiding the final argument? ***. Avoiding catastrophe is not the same as thriving. A world that narrowly avoids self-destruction is still not necessarily just equitable or joyful. The real opportunity lies not only in avoiding the last argument, but in building a first conversation, one rooted in mutual respect, sustainable development, and long-term thinking. Imagine a world where global cooperation defeats climate change, where education is universal, where technology uplifts rather than oppresses, where conflict is rare and peace is maintained not by force, but by trust. This is not utopia. It is possible, if unlikely, and therefore worth striving for. Such a future demands boldness, humility, and imagination. It requires that we think like ancestors, that we live not just for ourselves, but for those who will come long after us. In that way, perhaps the true last argument is not one of war or death, but of resolve. A collective, global vow, never again. Conclusion to Section 4 *. The danger of a final argument remains real, but so too does the power of prevention. In every age, humanity has been tested by its own potential for destruction, and every time, some have risen to resist it. Today, that responsibility belongs to all of us. Through thoughtful dialogue, ethical innovation, education, and cultural transformation, we can ensure that the last argument is never made. In its place, we can begin something better.